Hello and welcome to this game review. We will focus on the rook endgame, but until then there were a few moments. So here we got to the Caro-Kann, and the first moment here was here, where black recaptured with the b pawn towards the center, which is kind of the most natural recapture here. But unfortunately now, if white had played b4, then this pawn on c6 will be quite useless, as it cannot ever advance to c5, and if it does not advance, then it will just become a weakness to an eventual move like this, or knight b3 to knight a5. Also, we have isolated the pawn on the a file, so instead we should only take back with the pawn if it cannot be isolated and that we're sure that we can play c5, like in this game. And here f4 is not a very good move by white, putting more pawns on dark squares, weakening the king and weakening the e4 square. And here black decided to get rid of the tension, which is possible, but maybe we could first pile up on the d4 square and the b2 square to maybe put some more pressure. Anyway, we got eventually this endgame with knight e4, but maybe we shouldn't have exchanged queens here. The queen is not on a very stable square, as it can be pushed away with rook b4. Well, rook c4, I mean, this knight is also badly placed, so we should not really allow it to move. The knight is currently pinned, and also white's king is a lot weaker, as it only has one pawn protecting it, well, kind of two, while our king is very safe, which all of this leads to us moving the queen anywhere basically. Just don't exchange it. Queen b7 is maybe the best. Next move can be rook c4. We can eventually prepare some a5, a4, and black is quite a bit better positionally, as we have the e4 square. So knight e4 instead. Now we got this endgame, and black decided to eventually exchange the knights, which is fine. Maybe we didn't have to do this. Rook a8 seems a bit better, but okay. Now we get this rook endgame. We take the only open file, and after rook a1, black is a little bit better due to the structure, and also because he has the central pawns, which can eventually start moving. So f6 happens, and now white gives up the a file, which is a very passive way to play. And in rook endgames, the first rule is always rook activity. We should get our rook as active to a position as possible. So rook a1 should be played, after which first the king would have to go to the side of the board, which is not a good sign. And if he goes rook f1, which is already quite hard to do psychologically for white, the engine says that this is kind of equal in the pawn endgame, but of course it is black who is pushing, as he has the passed pawn, and white doesn't really have a way to create one. So even though the engine says this should be a draw, it would be extremely difficult for white. So instead king f7, king activity is also a thing, but the priority is always rook activity. So here again, with rook a1, we could put our rook on b1 or d1, and it would forever tie down this rook to b2. So instead king f7, rook e2, rook a2, but again we should get our rook as active as possible. And on b1 it is a bit more active, as it has more scope to go towards the king side or stay on the queen side, while on a2 it can only attack b2. And now a pretty big mistake by black, e5, which just exchanges a lot of pawns. There was no reason to allow the white rook to become active. At the moment black has the advantage precisely because he has the more active rook, so he should just continue improving his pieces. The king can go to d6, the pawn can go to b5, eventually we can play e5, and white cannot really do anything. Instead, here e5 was played, and after some trades, black got the pawn, I mean white got his rook quite active on e5, at least he could have. And after, for example, rook b2, king e3, we should understand that here, even though black is a pawn ahead, the activity is miles better for white now. The king is very active, and the rook will take this pawn. This is a weakness, and the white is not much worse anymore. Instead king e3, but this allows black to continue improving. g4, again white should prioritize rook activity, but g4. Now black plays this move g5, which is kind of a strange move. Instead, again, rook activity should be prioritized. Now there are more weaknesses, like here, so the rook belongs on the first rank, if it can go there. And after this, rook h2, I mean rook f2, white could have gotten some kind of activity like this. For example, if here rook h2, take here, take on b6 probably, and the position should peter out to a draw. Instead, king d3. Now finally black plays this move rook a1, and now white cannot really do anything on the king side. He doesn't really have counterplay, and the rook is much more active for black. And from here black played quite well, pushing e4, putting his king on the e5 square, and from here black managed to pick up one pawn. The pawn count is now equal, but it's clear that black is winning as he has two passed pawns which are quite close. And from here rook g1 is a typical device, now getting the pawn to e2 and eventually to e1, which will win the game. So eventually black found the idea of activating the rook through a1, and as a general rule, and the most active position for a rook, it's not only one that attacks something, but one from which it can go to attack more weaknesses. So for example here, instead of g5, if we prioritize rook activity, we would put it on b1 or anywhere else on the first rank, because from there it can also attack b2 and h3 as well.